Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Hannah and this is A Date with Miss Hannah. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video if it is useful, and share to all your friends so that we can all benefit from this. So in today's video, we're going to start with the theories of poverty. We finished the key definitions or key terms in poverty. You can check with my previous video. So theory number one is the traditional theory. Initially, poverty was conceived to be God given, i.e., a part of the natural order of things, that God created some people to be poor. In the Victorian times, that is the 19th to the 20th century, the treatment of poverty by the classical and neoclassical schools of thought, or the so-called orthodox approaches, initiated the formal analysis of poverty. It began to be conceived as an individualistic problem caused by laziness, thriftlessness, and lack of initiative. So in the traditional theory, people believed that poverty was a natural thing, just like we can have drought, just like we can have floods. And they still believe that one could escape poverty if they worked harder. That means the poor were lazy, they were hopeless, they lacked initiative. Surprisingly, the principles of assumptions on which the classical and neoclassical schools of economics rest are nowadays the most strongly affirmed in the economics profession. Having gained over time the labels conventional, mainstream, or even orthodox, the assessments and analysis of poverty performed in general by economists have, by and large, been approached mainly from the classical or neoclassical perspective. The other theory is the classical theory of poverty. Classical theory typically assumes that the outcomes of the exchange taking place in the marketplace are efficient, and hence wages faithfully reflect individual productivity. To the proponents of this theory, poverty is mainly seen as consequences of poor individual choices, e.g. the poor lack self-control. So in the classical theory of poverty, poverty is mainly seen as a consequence of poor individual choices. It is a consequence of the choices individuals make. So if you make poor choices, that is how you end up poor, according to the classical theory of poverty. The poor individual choices that affect productivity negatively, although it is acknowledged that pure differences in underlying genetic abilities are also potential causes of poverty. So they also believe that underlying genetic differences in underlying genetic abilities, for example, one person may be stronger than the other, maybe they are taller than the other, so they are preferred. So those differences can also be a cause of poverty, according to the classical theory of poverty, leaving alone the individual choices themselves. They also believe that the wrong choices made by individuals may lead them to find themselves in a poverty or welfare trap. Maybe you chose the wrong job, maybe you chose the wrong boss, the wrong business. So you're going to find yourself in a poverty trap because of your choice. Beyond a minimum level to prevent destitution, state intervention is generally viewed adversely as a source of economic inefficiency by generating incentives that are misaligned between poor individuals and society as a whole. Welfare programs are perceived as a potential cause for or reinforcement of poverty through welfare dependence. A large majority of the policy prescriptions under this view focuses on efforts to raise the productivity of deprived individuals in order for them to join the labor force as soon as possible. Although it is acknowledged that some individuals, the young, the sick, the old, cannot participate and will need alternative support. So that was the classical theory of poverty that believes that people are poor because of the choices they make. Then culture of poverty theory. This is number 3. Proponents of this theory, notably American anthropologist Oscar Lewis, argue that the poor are poor because they have different values and ways of life from the rest of the society, which impedes them from getting out of poverty. So Oscar Lewis, who is an American anthropologist, and other proponents of that theory believe that, according to the culture of poverty theory, people are poor because they are living differently from the rest of the society, and this stops them from coming out of poverty. So they argue that the poor are poor because they have different values and ways of life from the rest of the society, which impedes them from getting out of poverty. They further argue that the poor people's behavior, the poor people's behavioral preferences are passed on across generations within dynastic families due either to a genetic component or upbringing. In other words, if my grandfather was poor and he brought me, according to the culture of poverty theory, it is a person's way of life that makes them poor. So if my grandfather had a certain way of life, obviously he's going to treat my parents the same way. So they're also going to treat me in that very same way. So we are going to continue with that very same way of life. And that is how we keep in the poverty trap. The poverty is going to keep recurring and recurring and recurring. So they're saying that they believe that poor people's behavioral preferences are passed on across generations within dynastic families due either to a genetic component or upbringing. Hence the rhetoric, poverty begets poverty. Or hence the saying, poverty begets poverty. As children growing up in dysfunctional families feed from their deviant behavior of progenitors who act as the role models. So children are learning from their parents and they are going to live the same way their parents lived. So they are going to keep carrying on that very same way of life. Then we have recent contributions arising from this perspective assert that the transmissions of attitudes relating to poverty can be perpetuated via a persisting culture of poverty, which may help poor families cope with low economic means. Lewis asserted that the poorest sections of society tend to form a special subgroup with distinctive traits that are largely self-perpetuating. He thus stated that poverty, in short, is a way of life remarkably stable and persistent, passed down from generation to generation along family lines. So according to Lewis 1965, poverty is a way of life, remarkably stable. That means it is not going to change, and persistent. So it is going to keep happening and happening and happening the same way. And he says it is passed down from generation to generation along family lines. Then we go to the neoclassical theory of poverty. The neoclassical theory of poverty, this theory was advanced by neoclassical economist Alfred Marshall. Building on the classical tradition, neoclassical theory stresses the role of the unequal initial endowment of talents, a market-based competitive economic system. Proponents of this theory argue that market failures such as externalities, moral hazards, and adverse selection, as well as incomplete information, are also viewed as aggravators or causes of poverty. This is according to Davis 2007. Proponents argue that market failures create uncertainty, which may play a major role in causing poverty because the poor are more vulnerable to shocks to their well-being. So according to the neoclassical theory of poverty, proponents, they look at poverty having been caused by market failures, and these market failures are going to create uncertainties, which are going to create more poverty. How? They believe that the poor are going to keep being poor because the poor are vulnerable to shocks or uncertainties. For example, if there is an illness that breaks out, let's say, for example, the COVID-19, when COVID-19 came in, the poor suffered more because obviously they did not have any money set aside, they did not have any assets set aside, and yet the rich had probably money set aside to help them in such situations and were able to survive. But the poor were not able to survive even. They even didn't know what they would eat the following day. The country has been shut down, the economy is shut down, people are not working, and this person has been earning on a daily basis, and this is all they have. They've been earning maybe 6,000 every day, and that abruptly they have to stop working. So obviously they don't know what they are going to do after that. So they believe that these market failures, these uncertainties, the shocks affect the poor mostly. For example, the recessions, business recessions, sicknesses, family breakdowns, and so on. So this is how poverty keeps on and keeps going on and on and on due to market failures. Then we have the liberal theory of poverty, or the Kinesian theory. The liberal theory revolves around the idea that not only market distortions but also broad underdevelopment in its multiple facets cause poverty. So they believe that poverty can be caused by not only market distortions but also broad underdevelopment. The most prominent pioneer of liberal economists, John M. Keynes, believed that market forces can promote economic development, which was in turn perceived to be the single most important tool against poverty, just as the neoclassical Alfred Marshall. So we've said Alfred Marshall says, um, Alfred Marshall believes that market failures in the neoclassical theory, that market failures are the major cause of poverty. So this Keynesian theory is also saying not only market distortions but also under development. However, they also believe that market forces can promote economic development, which was in turn perceived to be the single most important tool against poverty, just as the neoclassical Alfred Marshall. In a Keynesian or liberal perspective, poverty is mainly explained by the misfortune of certain minorities who fall out of work, cannot work, or are not expected to, although they wish to do so. It therefore follows that the state needs to act to regulate, supplement, and exhort, but not impose in order to end poverty. From the set of macroeconomic variables, however, modern economists, the new Keynesians, stress that poverty is a result of lack of factor inputs such as land, capital, skills, etc. So the modern economists believe that a person will be poor if they lack the resources, they lack the factor inputs, that is land, capital, skills, and so many others. So if you do not have, if maybe somebody says, I'm going to give out land, so very many people will be able to come out of poverty because some are going to carry out farming, some are going to, rear animals on their land, some will sell the land to invest in their businesses. So you're able to actually, work your way out through poverty if you're given capital, if people are given the skills, because in this generation, very few people lack the hands-on skills. So that is how poverty keeps on persisting and persisting. So the modern economists or the new Keynesians stress that poverty is as a result of lack of factor inputs such as land, capital, skills, etc. needed in generating the type of growth that permits poverty relief. If entrepreneurial investment is low, this in turn raises unemployment and poverty rates among suppliers of labor. So that is all for today. We shall come back with our next video talking about measures of poverty.